The Black Hole, a novel by Alan Dean Foster. Chapter 12. No one was more aware of the frantic passage of time than the two men who waited nervously in the cockpit of the little research ship. Booth again checked his chronometer, asked in frustration, "How much longer are they going to wait? If they can't make it, they can't make it. There's no reason for us to die, too." "There's still time, Harry, I'm sure." Distorted by the nearby crackle of energy weapons, Holland's voice sounded over the console speaker. "Charlie, do you read me?" Pizer hurried to reply. "Loud and clear, Dan." He lied. The captain had enough to worry about. Pizer could understand him well enough. "Time's up," Holland spoke calmly, resignedly. "Take her clear." Pizer thought a moment. "Where are you?" "Side corridor," came the labored reply. "Near reception. They've got the passage blocked, though. We can't get through. They've got us pinned down. Lift off, Mr. Pizer. You know your orders. I haven't got time to argue with you." A hissing shriek drowned out his final words as a laser beam passed frighteningly close to the communicator grid. Pizer had known what he would do if such a situation arose. He had known before they had separated earlier on the ship. Maybe Holland knew too, he thought. He told himself that was the case, rationalizing his incipient actions as fast as possible. His shipmates were close by, too close for him to obey orders. He wouldn't mind a court-martial, not if Holland and Vincent were around to give evidence against him. If that was his destiny, why, then he was doomed no matter what he chose to do, so why worry? Such are the convoluted justifications of the truly brave. Booth stepped as if to block his way. "You heard the captain. Orders are to lift clear." "You're pretty big on talking heroics, Harry, and on reporting 'em. Let's see some." Leaving Booth to consider those words, Pizer pushed past the older man. With a muffled curse, the reporter raced after him. Pizer was out into the reception area before any of the sentries, concentrating on the battle for the passageway, reacted to his unexpected appearance. He leaped to one side and fired as the single guard there brought up his weapons. The machine blew apart as Booth dived for the cover of a desk. The first officer quickly regained his feet. He was trying to orient himself when the groans reached him. "Damn!" "Harry, you hit?" He hunted for the reporter, saw his boots sticking out from behind the desk. "My leg." Booth was holding it gingerly. He sat up slowly, grimacing from the pain. "How bad?" asked Pizer, concerned. I think it's broken." "From laser fire? I didn't think that sentry got off a shot." As he spoke, he was anxiously scanning the large room. The single mechanical had been alone, however. "No, from idiocy. I took a dive for cover that I shouldn't have." He touched his lower leg and winced. "When I was 30, I would have bounced. I'm afraid I'm not as flexible as I used to be, Charlie." "Can you walk?" Pizer knew he couldn't help the reporter and the others at the same time. With Pizer's help, Booth got to his feet, put a little weight on the leg. "The real pain won't hit for a few minutes yet. I can limp, I think." "All right. Get back to the ship and take up a good defensive position near the lock. We'll be counting on you to make sure none of them gets on board, Harry." "Right. Don't you worry about that. I'll make sure nothing boards." Pizer hurried off toward the nearby scene of action, directed by the noise of fighting. He rounded a bend, skidded to a halt. Ahead was the barricade and its platoon of shielded mechanicals. "I'm behind them, Dan," he whispered into his communicator. "What's your advice?" "My advice was to lift clear, Charlie," came the reply. "But since you've more guts than brains, use your own judgment. I'm the one who was fool enough to get himself pinned down here." Pizer hesitated, thinking, planning. On the other hand, he abruptly decided, long-range planning had never been one of his strong points. From what he had observed of Reinhardt's sentries, it certainly wasn't one of theirs either. confuse them. Don't give them time to react, he told himself. Jumping out into clear view, he charged the barricade, more concerned with creating a diversion than destruction. He fired as rapidly as he could. So closely packed were the sentries behind the wall, however, that his firing was more effective than he had hoped. It was up to Dan and Kate to realize what was happening and fire carefully in his direction. At the sound of Piser's berserker yelp, the robots turned to confront their unexpected new assailant. Holland, McRae, and the two hovering robots charged the barricade simultaneously. Caught in a mental as well as a strategic dilemma, the sentries were soon reduced to scrap. Ignoring the occasional hot sparks that flew from isolated sections of mechanicals, Piser stepped over the heaps of steaming metal. Now that the immediate danger was over, he was a little appalled at his audacity. A good thing that he hadn't taken the time to think his actions through. Holland and the others were already hurrying past him. McRae grabbed his arm. "Come on, Charlie!" Partway down the access passage, they were halted by a call from behind. Old Bob fluttered near a wall. The whine from his repellers was higher now, intermittent. "You go ahead," the damaged machine told them. "I'll stay here and cover you against any fresh pursuit. I can't travel fast enough, and you can't spare the seconds." Vincent looked at his human companions. "Captain, Mr. Piser." Both men holstered their weapons, retraced their steps. Holland examined the robot, shook his head in frustration. "We can't carry him. He's too heavy for the three of us." "That isn't necessary, sir," said Vincent. "If you and Mr. Piser can give him some support, he can redirect power from his stabilizer repellers to those providing forward drive." "Please, it's not necessary." "Shut up," Holland ordered Bob. "If it weren't for you, we'd probably all be dead by now." Piser moved to the other side of the hovering machine. Each man slipped his arms beneath Bob's own, carefully avoiding the repeller grids beneath. They appeared to be carrying him as they started back down the corridor. McRae and Vincent were on the alert for sentries. Booth's injured leg had apparently undergone a healing nothing short of miraculous. Running without any hint of damage, he had rushed back up the umbilical and into the Palomino. A quick jab closed the locked door behind him. The command cockpit was a maze of instrumentation, but most of it was automatic, and after 18 months of spare time, he had managed to study the basic controls thoroughly. They would now provide more than amusement. As he studied the pilot's console, he fought to recall the answers to the many frivolously asked questions he had put to Holland. He hesitated only briefly before commencing to program the ship's systems. A thin smile of satisfaction creased his face when the engines came on. Several critical gauges on the overhead console lit up. He had power. Now all the ship needed was direction, velocity, and its freedom. Holland and the others staggered into reception. As they reached the open space, the two men let go of Bob and moved in opposite directions to present smaller targets to the anticipated welcoming party of sentries, but reception was deserted. The only sentry present was the one Piser had obliterated on his emergence from the umbilical. "Stands to reason," McRae was saying, breathing heavily. "Reinhardt can only have so many sentry machines. Some of them would have to be deployed elsewhere on the ship to ensure we couldn't make mischief with, say, the engines." Then something made her frown. Her companions also heard it. The sound of distant engines, louder than those of the Cygnus. They rushed toward the connector passageway. "What's that idiot trying to do?" Piser's voice reflected his outrage and dismay. Holland grabbed him, slowed him down. "It's too late." He pointed out the nearby port. The umbilical had already disconnected from the Palomino, was shrinking in on itself like a worm wriggling back into its hole. They were cut off from their ship. A moment later, the Palomino was drifting silently away from them, the sound of its familiar engines having ceased as soon as the umbilical had been dropped. They stood quietly by the port and watched, each lost in his or her private thoughts. "What a fool I was," McCrae muttered. "If I'd just done what Reinhardt wanted, you'd all be aboard and safely on your way." "We're not all Harry Booths, Kate." Holland smiled thinly at her. "I'd still have come after you." She smiled back, met his questioning stare. Their reverie was interrupted by a shout of surprise from Pizer. "Look!" They turned from each other, temporarily putting aside, but not forgetting, no, never forgetting, the unspoken bond that had formed between them. Time enough for elaboration of that non-verbal exchange later. Time enough, if they lived. The Palomino had been climbing steadily away from the Cygnus. Now it was changing direction. No longer moving away, it had commenced to arc slowly back toward the Cygnus. In the pilot's chair, Booth fought frantically with the stubborn controls. Steering a sophisticated craft like the Palomino was not like driving a personal transport, no matter how many automatics it possessed. Hasty, panicky reactions were apt to be more counterproductive than helpful. Everything Booth did only seemed to exacerbate the problem. Reinhardt was equally aware of the smaller ship's troubles. It was coming dangerously near the Cygnus. "That ship is out of control. Blow it apart before it hits us. Fire! Quickly! Now!" He stared anxiously at the smaller vessel, not caring any longer who might be aboard it. Laser cannons tracked the tumbling research vessel uncaringly. Silent orders activated automatic rangers. The Palomino intersected a predicted point in space. Several energy beams simultaneously struck that intersection. The Palomino disintegrated in a brilliant shower of molten metal and torn fragments of self. One such large fragment was ejected at considerable speed toward the stern of the Cygnus. It happened to strike a particularly vulnerable section of the great ship, tearing through sensitive instrumentation. Internal door locks slammed shut, trying to isolate the region from which air was escaping. Former members of the Cygnus's crew who were caught in the sealed-off area passed blissfully into death. The fragment slashed through the port engine control station. Vast energies were left temporarily unbound. Automatic safeties locked down as fast as possible, but they could operate no faster than the electrons flowing through their circuitry. There was a substantial explosion. It rocked the whole structure of the Cygnus. In reception, everyone except the floating robots grabbed for something stable. Nothing met that requirement, but the ship soon steadied itself. Artificial gravity once again took firm hold of the ship's contents, including the now shipless crew of the vanished Palomino. "Harry! Oh my God!" McCrae murmured. She stared out the port at the rapidly dispersing particles of what had once been their ship, and Harry Booth. "I should have known he was all talk and no guts and locked him up." Pizer was feeling somewhat less than regretful at the reporter's sudden, unexpected demise. "Don't be too hard on him, Charlie." Holland was trying to concentrate on two matters at once. "He had reason to think we were the crazy ones, not him. He panicked. Harry reported science, but I don't think he ever really enjoyed or understood it. Anyway, he may have done us a favor. Reinhardt might have intended to blow us up all along. I'm certain he would have tried if we'd managed to get aboard with Kate. Thanks to Harry, we're still alive." "And where there's life," Vincent began. Pizer cut him off bitterly. He was in no mood for the robot's humorous homilies. "He was trying to save his own skin, Dan. Don't make him out to be some sort of martyr." "There's a saying, sir," the unflappable robot went on, "that you can't unscramble eggs." "A penny's worth of philosophy won't buy us out of this. A good offense is the best defense." "Vincent," Pizer said in utter exasperation, Maybe if you took your witticisms and... He stopped, forced himself to consider seriously what the robot was saying. You mean go after Reinhardt and turn the ship around? He shook his head. We wouldn't have a chance. It's one thing to fight our way through corridors to here, but he'd never let us in the control tower. He'd seal himself in first. By the time we could try something extreme like donning suits and breaking through the dome, it'd be too late. That was not what I had in mind, Mr. Pisa. There is an alternative. I don't follow you. Holland, who had also been devoting considerable thought to their seemingly hopeless situation, did. The probe ship. The one that's already returned from the event horizon. It's equipped with the same Cygnus process drive and the same null G field. Vincent, you're a genius. Yes, sir. The robot acknowledged modestly. It's part of my programming. Holland turned to the others, waiting mechanical. Bob, what's the quickest way to the probe dock? Internal air car, he replied instantly. I can program one to carry us directly to the dock. He was already starting back up the corridor. A gaping wound near her stern, the Cygnus plunged ahead, accelerating toward the lambent vortex of the black hole. Excited to fluorescence by the storm of radiation pouring out from the event horizon, glowing gases began to fill space around the ship. Angry auroras swarmed around the ports. Reinhardt was studying the ship's progress when a buzzer demanded his attention. Switching to a rear-facing scanner, he studied the view thus presented in silence. Magnification was increased. A swarm of irregular-shaped objects was cutting the course of the ship. Hasty calculations indicated they would overtake the Cygnus. Meteorites overtaking us? I knew there'd be a lot of cosmic debris sucked in with us, but I'd hoped. Maximilian, bring up the output on the starboard power center. We still have partial power from 2 of the 4 engines on the port side. Double the output on the others. We have to increase our speed. Lights flashed across the huge mechanical's chest in a sequence indicating uncertainty and advising caution. Do as I say. We must seize the moment, Maximilian. His eyes were wide, wild. Hold our course. We will outrun the debris or ride out any impact. Pursued by the soulless components of a planet that never was, the Cygnus thundered onward, but she did not gain enough velocity to outrace the tumbling matter that had crossed her astern. One jagged chunk of nickel iron plowed lazily into the crest of the ship, completely destroying what had been the reception area. The impact jarred the entire ship. Holland stumbled, struggled to regain his footing. The whoosh of escaping air that had sounded momentarily, terrifyingly in his ears, was cut off as a locked door slammed tight behind them. The air car terminus was nearby. They followed Bob into the first of the little vehicles. Holland programmed it according to Bob's directions. All around the ship, meteorites disintegrated under the increasing gravitational forces, or succumbed to intense internal radiation, or collided with one another and silently exploded. Through the transparent walls of the air car cylinder tube, they could view the external destruction and the increasingly disturbed radiation that colored the vacuum. Something singed Holland's hair. He looked ahead to see another air car rushing directly for them. Still programmed to seek out and destroy the intruders, 4 sentry robots were firing across the rapidly shrinking distance between the 2 cars. Under the increasing stress, the cylinder itself began bucking and groaning. Holland recalled the flexibility of the null G field, wondered if the damage to the ship's engines or the meteorite that had just impacted, or perhaps both, had done anything to reduce the field's stability. If so, the ship might come apart around them any second. Vincent and Bob returned the fire of the approaching sentries. Seeing that the onrushing vehicle was not about to slow, Holland assumed manual control of their car. He sent them sliding up in a high bank onto the side of the transport tube without reducing speed. The startled sentries raced on past below them. With a final sorrowful groan, the transport tube buckled, broke. An internal lock slammed down instantly, shutting the tube off from the vacuum outside. The car carrying the sentries continued forward, flying out into space with its occupants still turning to fire. There was damage ahead as they once more found themselves traveling through the ship. Holland brought the air car to a halt, looked for a break. "We can't go any farther over this," he decided. "We'll have to try walking the main corridor." Bob led them away from the car. The main corridor and its catwalks were still intact. But by now, walking itself was difficult. It was clear that the null G field was oscillating dangerously. One moment the ship sailed calmly onward. The next, the Cygnus barely shook free of the increasing gravitational pull. The muffled rumble of distant collisions echoed through the passageway. They had started down the corridor when a violent shock forced them to halt, struggling just to remain upright. Refugee from some distant corner of space, a flaming ball of matter broke through the ceiling, its velocity reduced by passage through the Cygnus's null G field and several intervening decks. It did not continue its progress through the ship. Instead, it struck and bounced, tumbling at high speed toward the little group of temporarily paralyzed onlookers. There being no place to hide, everyone dropped to the deck. Not that it mattered. The glowing metal flew by overhead, annihilated the section of catwalk they had already traversed, and vanished through a partition. It was apparently intended by the fates that they should have no time in which to breathe freely before either escaping or perishing. Another laser beam passed close by Pizer. Exhausted, they turned to locate the new threat. A single sentry was standing in a side corridor, firing at them while reporting into a wall communicator. Holland and the others concentrated their combined fire in its direction, and the mechanical was soon shattered. Before or after it had completed its report, Pizer wondered. The reception on the screen was jumbled and indistinct, but clearly enough for a furious Reinhardt to see that his guests were still mobile. The picture was so poor he was unable to tell how many of them were left, but the presence of even one antagonist running free aboard the ship during the next critical minutes was not to be tolerated. "I want them finished this time, Maximilian." He turned back to his readouts, cursing the accidental encounter that had reduced the Cygnus's power and rendered it vulnerable to the swarm of meteorites. But for them, even the loss of nearly half his power would not have been sufficient to threaten the great experiment. If the ship suffered further damage to its engines, however, he would lose something far more important than mere speed. The null G field would be weakened to the degree that it might no longer be able to protect the Cygnus from the immense gravitational strength of the black hole. Several shards of interstellar flotsam narrowly missed striking the command tower itself. One deep-range sensor antenna was completely torn away. Others struck and damaged the corridors leading to the ship's stern. Another impacted close by the docked probe ship. It leaned precariously, almost breaking free of its co-joining umbilical. Reinhardt resolutely kept his ship on its predetermined course. In free space, the Cygnus could have avoided the meteorite swarm easily by a sharp change of direction, but within the gravitational vortex surrounding the collapsar, that was not possible. Furthermore, the ship was continually being torn apart by the stress, the resultant fragments flying in unpredictable directions. Holland and Bob led the way as they stumbled into one of the hydroponics stations. Gathering sentries followed close behind, exchanging fire with their tiring quarry. Pizer heard a ripping sound. There was the sudden whoosh of escaping atmosphere. A tiny hole had appeared at the apex of the dome overhead, enough to suck vast quantities of air out into space. Automatic pressure sensors immediately sent fresh air pouring into the area, but the circuitry that should have slammed shut inner doors surrounding the station to seal in the damaged area failed to function. Air continued to scream out into space, despite the valiant efforts of the temperature compensators. The dome turned dangerously cold. With the drop in pressure, ice began to form in the room. Plates broke, sending frozen bits of plant and hydroponic tubing swirling through the dome, caught in the miniature hurricane pouring upward through the ceiling puncture. Old Bob jetted over to McCrae. His repeller units fought to keep him from being drawn upward. "Hang on to me!" he yelled. Letting go of the stanchion she was clinging to, she carefully transferred herself to the machine. With Bob battling the wind, they drifted across the now frozen surface of the deck toward the far doorway, still jammed open by failed circuits. Holland and Pizer were also trying to fight their way across. They grabbed at anything still secured to the deck. Frozen missiles that had been alive and green seconds ago whizzed dangerously around them. Only Vincent's constant distracting of the pursuing robots enabled the two men to concentrate on making their way safely across the station. It occurred to Vincent that it might be time to take some of his own advice concerning caution. He was battling the oncoming sentries alone, a confrontation that eventually had to prove fatal. Turning, he jetted toward the center of the dome. At least there he had more room to maneuver. The sentries single-mindedly continued their pursuit. Dodging in different directions, Vincent was a difficult target to concentrate on. As he was the only one still offering steady resistance, the sentries directed the majority of their fire at him. McCrae could feel the strain in the machine carrying her. It would drop half a meter, then struggle back up to its former altitude. The whine from Bob's repellers grew steadily more erratic. They would plunge almost to nothing before picking up fitfully again. The temperature in the room continued to fall, placing an added burden on the poorly maintained Bob unit. But they were almost to the beckoning doorway. She stared at the opening with a mixture of hope and horror. If its damaged emergency module suddenly became actuated, the door would slam irrevocably shut. They would be trapped in the dome. She tried to will it to remain open. Holland blinked against the wind-borne particles, tried to see overhead. The hole in the dome appeared to have widened slightly. The hurricane intensified around them. He could feel the dangerous pull increasing on his body. If he lost his hold, he would be helplessly sucked up and out into the void. Radical decompression by exposure to vacuum was a rotten, messy way to die. Despite the growing numbness in his fingers, he held tight to the railing, continued to pull himself toward the far doorway. Pizer was ahead of him, nearly to safety. That left only Vincent. The robot should be just behind him. "Vincent, are you—" He had intended to ask if the mechanical was all right, but a quick glance backward was enough to show that Vincent wasn't. He could see external parts beginning to freeze up. Vincent could stand the ultimate cold of empty space, so the frost beginning to coat his shell made no sense, but it was there, no doubt about it. Vincent's evasive hovering slowed. He came up close to Holland, halted. Then the uprushing gale got hold of him, began to draw him up and back. Holding on with one hand, Holland reached back with a convulsive swipe, barely securing a grip on one of the robot's outstretched arms. His muscles protesting, he pulled the hovering machine slowly down toward him. They started again for the doorway. If he lost his remaining hold on the rail, they would both vanish through the hole in the dome before Pizer or McCrae knew they were gone. Programmed only to follow and destroy, the sentries had begun to cross the open area of the dome station. They slowed as if time had stopped for them. They began spiraling upwards slowly, helplessly toward the roof. Old Bob and McCrae were already standing in the corridor beyond the locked door. Pizer was next through, having to fight past the wind rushing down the corridor into the dome. Like a man swimming upstream, Holland somehow managed to get Vincent and himself into the passageway. Old Bob immediately fired at the control module housing. The door slammed down. The gale slowed and swirled directionlessly about them. They stamped their feet, tried to warm numbed hands. McCrae wondered about frostbite. She could not feel the tips of her fingers. It was Pizer who started first down the corridor. "We can't wait here. If those sentries manage to open that door, we'll be blown back into the dome. I couldn't make that crossing again. We've got to get moving, Dan." Holland examined the panting, chilled group of humans and machines. Vincent was slowly thawing, but the cold had penetrated his metal body deeply. He seemed unable to stagger more than a few centimeters forward before having to stop and rewarm. "Take Bob and Kate," he told Pizer. "We'll catch up." McCrae shook her head, spoke tersely. "No way." "We can help him along. Take some of the load off his repellers the way he did with Bob until his internal heating unit is back to strength." She put her arms around the robot, the cold metal momentarily taking her breath away. Holland did the same opposite her. Between them, they hurried Vincent along. Behind them, behind the now sealed door, the ceiling of the hydroponics dome finally burst under the pressure. The air rushed as a body out into space, carrying with it frozen bits of plants, shards of console, circuitry, and the remnants of the pursuing sentry robots. "What happened to you in there?" Holland asked the steadily warming robot. "Had to divert power from heating unit to repellers to avoid opposing fire. Chill worse than I thought." "That wasn't too bright." "All safe now. All alive, aren't we?" "We'll discuss it later," Holland replied curtly. He was angry at Vincent for almost getting himself frozen to electronic death, for taking risks that he, Holland, should have been taking. With Vincent's lights flickering unsteadily but with increasing strength, the little party of survivors staggered down the passageway, fighting to keep their balance as the ship shuddered around them. Chapter 13. Reinhardt glowered helplessly at his instruments and ranted at the storm as the Cygnus strove to remain intact under the barrage of meteorites, a great ungainly bird assailed by a swarm of potentially deadly bees. A glowing, globular wraith bore down on the command tower. Reinhardt saw it, stood transfixed by the inexorable approach of mass destruction. It just missed the tower itself, ripped into the superstructure nearby. The impact sent humanoids tumbling against one another. Several fell from the upper-level platform to lie still and twisted on the deck. Equipment dropped from secured places on the walls. Instrumentation snapped loose or winked out. "Alert all stations for emergency running. Maximilian, program the probe. We may have to use it." He studied the main screen. A tribute to its designers and builders, it still functioned enough, though the concussion had knocked it askew. Readouts set alongside another smaller screen offered the only good news. The last of the meteorites had swept past the Cygnus. There would be no more collisions. He tested various controls, demanded information. The 4 undamaged engines were still pulsing smoothly, as were the 2 still partially functional. Most of the remaining damage had been to the ship's midsection, heart-rending but not fatal. He still had ample power and a measure of control. but the readouts were full of warnings of sections so badly battered they might fall at any time. It did not matter now. It was too late to change mind or direction, even were he so inclined. Both he and the Cygnus were committed. The sudden silence and comparative stability of the deck underfoot was almost as frightening as the storm had been. The little group turned a corner. The corridor beyond was completely blocked by metal wreckage. Holland inspected it closely. "Can't see through. No telling how dense it is. Even if we had the capability, we don't have the time to burn our way through." McCrae was still waiting for the ceiling to come crashing down on them. "It's over. The storm is over." "Is there another way out, Bob? Another way that could take us around the probe's dock?" The mechanical turned, moved to a sealed doorway, and extended a portion of one arm. It fit into a matching receptacle set alongside the door. The metal panel slid aside, and they found themselves in an alcove directly over the damaged power center. There was atmosphere in the huge chamber. There had to be, or the door wouldn't have opened, no matter how insistent old Bob's electronic entreaties. No doubt Reinhardt's efficient machines had already repaired the outer hull where the large meteorite had entered, repressurized the chamber, and gone elsewhere to repair more of the extensive damage. But the repairs had not been perfect. Mixed in with the stale air was another odor McCrae recognized immediately: augmented hydrogen. "Dan, this entire complex could go up in flames at any minute." Holland had noticed the leakage. He stepped out gingerly onto the maintenance catwalk, crossing over the engines and the deck far below. It swayed dangerously under his weight, and he moved off. "Any other way around this, Bob?" "No, Captain," came the reply. "And we certainly can't go back through agriculture." Holland considered a moment. "Okay, take Kate across." She started to protest. "Now." Bob extended his arms. Deciding that time was now more important than principle, McCrae grabbed hold. Bob started off across the open space. "Charlie, you and Vincent are next." Pizer shook his head. "Too much weight." Vincent already had his limbs extended. "Nothing ventured, nothing gained, Mr. Pizer. Besides, there's no significant difference in weight between you and the captain. I'll travel above the catwalk just in case." Pizer looked unhappy, but took hold of the proffered metal limbs, and they started across, following Bob and McCrae. She looked over a shoulder, saw Holland receding behind her, and called out to the other, nearing robot. "Hurry, Vincent. You still got to get back for Dan." With the added burden of the humans, neither machine was making much speed. Holland realized he couldn't wait. A chance spark could ignite the drifting hydrogen mixture and turn the chamber into a short-lived but highly realistic little hell. He started out onto the catwalk. It swayed as before. Moving cautiously forward, he concentrated on maintaining his balance. "Hold tight, Mr. Charlie." Vincent was admonishing his passenger. The first officer was shaking with coughs as the air in the engine chamber became saturated with leaking gases. Old Bob and McCrae reached the platform on the other side. She let go, stepped clear, and looked back worriedly. Holland was halfway across when the catwalk finally gave way. Instinctively lurching forward, he clutched at the falling end and swung toward the far side. McCrae screamed. He turned his back toward the wall, somehow hung on as he slammed into it. The gas was beginning to affect him as it had Pizer, and he started to cough. Reaching up, he tried climbing the broken walkway, slipped, used all his remaining strength just to hang on. McCrae and Pizer were trying to see down over the edge of the platform through rising, darker gases. Neither had a thought of running for safety. "Dan!" McCrae shouted without looking across at Pizer. "I can't see him anymore." She bent over, coughed violently. "Get him out of here, Charlie," came Holland's muted order from somewhere below. Both ignored it. Vincent started downward. "I think Bob and I can bring him up, Mr. Charlie." "Go to it, Vincent." The robots drifted down into the rising gas. McRae and Pizer managed to open the door leading into the next corridor. Fresh air gusted gently inward, driving back some of the suffocating miasma. Carrying the dazed Holland carefully between them, the two machines reappeared moments later. They all started up the corridor. Holland was limping, and blood trickled from the gash over his eyes. McRae tried to support him, working on the wound at the same time. The wonder of it was that he hadn't broken every bone in his back when he had slammed into the wall. But then, she reminded herself, he had always been the resilient type. Reinhardt had forgotten the damage caused by the meteorite storm, had forgotten the disturbing presence of his only human adversaries. He was standing before the main screen, staring at the burgeoning blackness that expanded to shove fierce radiation to the sides. Soon they would pass beyond the event horizon. At that moment they would pass beyond the limits of human knowledge. They would then encounter oblivion, or a new universe. Or perhaps something no man had yet imagined. "They could not stop us," he murmured aloud. "We'll make it. To the universe beyond. To my universe and everlasting life." But Reinhardt was only a genius. He had plotted and gauged, predicted and planned, and anticipated as best as any mere genius could. The difficulty came from the fact that he no longer had the full strength of the Cygnus behind him. Only slightly more than half. As the calculations had insisted it would, the null G field compacted around the ship. Lacking full power, the field generation system was weakened. The already incomprehensible gravity it was passing through began to produce noticeable effects. Instrumentation was shaken, readouts grew uncertain. The command tower itself began to vibrate under the stress. "Increase power," he directed Maximilian. "Override the safeties on the starboard engines. We're going to maintain full field strength around us. We're going through!" Within the crippled starboard power center, a bit of metal fell from the ceiling. It struck another below, and a slight spark resulted. Suddenly the vast chamber was filled with flames. One of the engines, already damaged and unable to cope with heat from without as well as from within, imploded. There was a sudden disruption of the field inside the engine that kept the Cygnus process under control. A minute quantity of matter reacted with an equally minuscule amount of antimatter before the latter could be field-contained or dispersed spaceward. The resultant explosion blew out the rear section of the center, jolting the entire ship. Material and gas gushed out into the void. Elsewhere on the ship, Bob and Vincent reeled as the artificial gravity momentarily went berserk. Depending on their position, the three humans were thrown against floor or ceiling or wall. The lights in the corridor winked out. "Emergency battery system up full," Reinhardt gave the order as the extent of the damage began to appear on internal monitors. Light returned to the command tower. It was hesitant, flickering. As the pull of the collapsar began to affect the most massive portion of the Cygnus, where the field had weakened further, the ship started to drift sideways. This further complicated the efforts of the null G generation system to protect it. Holland helped Pizer to his feet. They ran faster now in the half-light. The walls of the corridor groaned around them. The first sections of the great ship to feel the intensified effects of the gravitational pull were those already weakened by contact with meteoric debris. Bits of loosened or torn superstructure shuddered, fell away from the exterior. This in turn unhinged the stability of the areas of which they were a part. Shivering dangerously, the command tower remained intact. More and more instrumentation winked out. The consoles themselves threatened to tear free of their wall mountings. Oblivious to the danger, humanoid robots continued to perform their designated tasks. Reinhardt had come to a painful but irrevocable decision. "Maximilian, prepare the probe ship. She's not going to hold under this kind of stress, not on half power." The massive mechanical turned obediently, moved toward the elevator. Reinhardt paused a moment before following. Slowly he turned to take a last look at the heart of what had become his private empire of discovery and exploration. 20 years of his life he had spent lobbying for the construction of the Cygnus, another 20 to bring it to this point in space. He would go on, but without it. He would not be cheated of his triumph. His entry into the new universe would only be a little less grand. Turning, he moved to follow Maximilian. A violent ripping noise made him look up. The overhead screen had torn loose from its braces. He had run 2 steps before something drove a knife into his legs. The screen struck with a resounding crash, pinning him to the deck close by the transparent wall of the tower. A brief, exhausting struggle proved he was hopelessly pinioned beneath the edge of the heavy viewer. "Maximilian, help me!" Another piece of instrumentation fell from above, shattered on the deck nearby. "Maximilian!" Reinhardt twisted his upper body, looking for his servant. The elevator door was closed. Maximilian had already departed. He turned his eyes to the rows of busy humanoids. "You! There! Help me! I said help me!" Programmed only to serve their assigned stations, they ignored him, even as those very stations broke down around them. A panicky Reinhardt turned away, found himself staring out the port. Though leaning dangerously, the probe ship still rested in its dock. Reinhardt began to lose his monumental self-control. "Fools! Listen to me! Somebody listen! Or we'll all perish!" There was no response from the humanoids. He had reprogrammed them too well. Turning his attention back to the screen, he tried again to push himself free. Occasionally, his gaze would travel to the still functioning main screen, to the view of the expanding blackness that would soon swallow the Cygnus. Somehow, Holland put aside consideration of the agony in his injured leg and kept pace with the others as they raced down the corridor. As the ship fell still deeper into the gravity well, it started to break up. The corridor trembled around the gasping group of refugees. The view through a wall port provided a boost no amount of rest could have equaled. They were nearing the probe dock. "This way!" shouted Holland. They turned a last bend and found themselves standing outside the lock leading to the connecting umbilical. But when Holland jabbed the stud to open the door, it remained unmoving. A red warning light came on instead as a nearby readout provided the explanation. Holland looked around grimly. "Connector's been severed." They started searching. McCrae found the hoped-for locker. A dozen suits were neatly arranged inside. They chose 3 with full tanks, helped each other dress as minutes ticked past. A brief check ensured that each suit was tight, that its internal oxygen system was functioning, and that the communicators were operative. Holland waved the others clear. Pizer and McCrae moved down the corridor, the 2 robots the other way. "Ready?" Everyone acknowledged by grabbing tight to a secured section of wall or railing. Wrapping one arm around a protruding tube, Holland leaned over and touched the 3 emergency studs in proper sequence. The explosive bolts blew the lock cover out into space. A brief but intense rush of air pulled hard at everyone. It faded as distant emergency doors shut tight, sealing them off from the rest of the ship. "Well, old-timer," Vincent was saying to Bob as they turned to head for the exit, "you're going home after all, and as a hero, too." "Had to uphold the honor of the old outfit, Vincent." McRae, standing by the exit, noticed something moving at the far end of the passageway. "Vincent! Bob! Look out!" Maximilian had appeared immediately behind the two machines. Bob reacted first, thus catching the full force of the large mechanical's lasers. Circuitry flared as he was thrown backward, bounced off a wall, and fell to the floor. Maximilian shifted to turn his weapons on Vincent and the others. The delay had given Vincent enough time to turn and fire himself. Both precisely aligned shots melted the pistols in Maximilian's hands. "Get to the ship," he instructed his human companions. "I'll handle this." Maximilian had not been rendered harmless, however. Two additional arms came up, tipped with whirling blades suitable for trimming metal. They were designed to repair. They could as easily dismember. Vincent hovered in his path, fired again. But the material of the larger robot's shell was considerably tougher than the thin alloy of the two obliterated lasers. Vincent fired again. The burst had no effect on the oncoming Maximilian. "Hurry, Captain!" Vincent backed away from the larger mechanical. The three humans exited through the blown hatch. Maximilian hesitated, then turned his full attention to the darting, distracting Vincent. He rushed up at him. The smaller machine dodged, fired again, seeking a weak place in the armored monolith and not finding one. Vincent dipped down to fire from closer range, ducked as the high-speed blades cut over his head. Maximilian shifted again, trying to corner his opponent against a wall. Vincent ducked and bobbed, firing. The edge of one blade snicked against his shell, sent him tumbling off balance into the wall. The impact appeared to have damaged his internal gyro balance system more than the blade had his exterior, and he fluttered in one place, experiencing the robotic equivalent of dizziness. Maximilian advanced on him. Outside the ship now, the three suited figures struggled to make their way toward the probe, pulling themselves through the twisted ruin of the Cygnus's external superstructure. Maximilian was on top of Vincent. The smaller robot spun, fired several rapid bursts, and just escaped through the small hole he had made in the hull before those whizzing blades could cut through his back. Devoid of lasers and Reinhardt's restraint, Maximilian used the incredibly tough blades to open the gap wider. He pursued Vincent out into space. There was more room to maneuver outside, but the torn surroundings were less predictable. Maximilian rushed forward. Vincent dodged, but backed into a curled length of metal. There was no cry of triumph as his opponent became trapped, but Maximilian pulsed a slightly deeper crimson as he moved forward and embraced Vincent in a hug capable of distorting the strongest metal alloys. A small door opened in Vincent's lower body. The larger machine had not immediately noticed the tiny but efficient cutter that emerged. It pierced the huge mechanical's midsection, played havoc with delicate internal circuitry. Tiny flares of fire spat from the hole as Maximilian loosened his grip and spun away. His hover controls had been severed. Unable to guide himself, he tumbled away from the Cygnus, caught in the intensifying tug of the black hole. Vincent spared the rapidly shrinking shape only a momentary glance before jetting back into the ship. Old Bob was still lying where he had struck the deck. Most of his lights were out. "Maximilian's finished," Vincent reported to him. "You did well." The reply from the metal form was faint. "Thanks to you, my friend. I'll get you aboard now." He drifted over the quiescent machine, prepared to extend service arms to encompass the barrel-shaped body. "No." The word was barely understandable. "I won't be going with you." Vincent hesitated. Desire battled realization inside him. He could not avoid analyzing the damage Maximilian's lasers had done. One blast had melted the majorities of Bob's logic and cognition modules. He had very little mind left. What had been destroyed could be replaced, but the Bob unit would have a new personality, a new self. He would not be what he was now. Humans talked a lot about an intangible they called the soul. In all the lengthy catalog of several thousand replacement parts for a Bob or a Vincent unit, there was not one that carried that label. "There's no need for me to go home," the fatally damaged robot was saying, perhaps trying to cheer his friend, perhaps only stating the obvious. "I am home, out here, the same for me as it is for you." The final lights began fading as power failed along with the intricate solid-state brain. "You're still new, still fully functional. Carry on for all of us, Vincent. The humans will remember and praise their lost associates from the crew of the Cygnus. Only you can remember for the machines. Go now. Help your friends." The last set of lights became dark. The thing on the deck was no longer alive. It was merely another piece of scrap metal, such as the Cygnus was fast becoming. The corridor was threatening to shake apart around Vincent. His shipmates might be having trouble outside. The suits they had donned were not equipped with free space maneuvering units. Vincent turned and jetted for the open hatch. Holland was working his way across the battered surface of the ship. The sound of the Cygnus tearing itself apart reached him as an eerie groaning through the substance of his suit. He ducked beneath a great arch of bent metal, pulled himself weightlessly across an artificial abyss. McCrae was right behind him, Pizer in back of her. He reached back and grabbed her hand to help her across the dangerously open space. For an instant, her body swung feet first out into space. Then he pulled her down to where she could obtain her own grip. The strength of the nearing black hole was beginning to overwhelm the failing artificial gravity of the Cygnus. Pizer looked back toward the ship's bow. The distant command tower was bending, twisting like a drunken lighthouse. He moved forward. His hand reached out for Holland's as he started to cross the gap, and their gloved palms parted. Slowly, helplessly, he began drifting away from the Cygnus. Another fragment of metal drifted near him. This one, however, was mobile. One metal arm extended to clutch a thrusting bit of superstructure. Then they were both once more alongside Holland and McCrae. "Thanks," Pizer told him. He was breathing hard from the narrowness of his escape. "A friend in need is a friend indeed." Vincent responded with a twinkle of lights. "You're learning, Mr. Charlie." Reinhardt saw the tiny figures reach the side of the probe, cursed them under his breath. He cursed the cosmos itself, the unpredictability of it and of man. Was there nothing pure and perfect a true scientist could cling to in the madness of the universe? He cursed them again, not because they had reached the probe, because he had not reached it with them. There was a violent splintering sound, and the vibration beneath him changed. The viewport exploded inward. Shards of transparent plastic shot past him. At the same time, the tower was torn free from the rest of the ship. Reinhardt's eyes bulged from sudden, savage decompression as he and the tower were thrown off into space, from decompression of flesh, from decompression of dream. Holland opened the lock. They entered the probe successfully and removed their suits. Soon they were crowding into the tiny cockpit. The probe had been designed to accommodate 2 humans. The 4 of them filled it tightly. McCrae happened to glance out the right port at the right moment. She saw the control tower spiraling away toward the vortex. "Command tower's torn loose." She experienced a brief moment of sorrow for Reinhardt, The sentiment was quickly quashed by the memory of the mind-wiped crew, of blank, featureless faceplates concealing equally blank minds. Her engines were still functioning, but the Cygnus was now directionless, completely out of control. The ship swung wildly in the down-spiraling well. One thruster broke free of its stern mounting, was followed by a section of broken bow. Similar forces clutched at the probe ship as Holland frantically fingered the instrumentation. The engines were activated, then the null G field. The shaking stopped. But they were still attached to the Cygnus. "We better get the hell off," he muttered. "The whole ship's breaking up." He touched one control, then another. Thrust, and the probe lifted clear of the Cygnus. Operating the console manually, Holland took them away from the ship. He was trying to put distance between them and the dangerous chunks of metal flying off the larger vessel. They were clear, and he rested a moment, but the probe accelerated anyway, commenced a wide arc toward the collapsar. Nearby, the Cygnus continued to destruct. No longer protected by a null G field, it was breaking into smaller and smaller sections. Everyone aboard had reacted to the sudden, unprogrammed increase in velocity. Holland frantically began examining the instrumentation, trying to recall the phase sequence of 20-year-old circuitry. Nothing slowed the ship's acceleration, nor it altered its course. "I don't understand." His muscles were tight with tension and a little fear. Even with the null G operating, they could sense an occasional tremor running through the ship as increasing gravity tugged at it. The field's working as it should, but none of the other controls are responding. His hands weaved futile patterns over the instruments. "It's no good. I can't turn her." "There's no question about it, Captain." Vincent had settled back from the console and his own efforts to influence their course. "The ship has been pre-programmed. I don't have the necessary information to override it. Only 2 individuals might." "Reinhardt and Maximilian." McCrae was surprised at how fast she had resigned herself to the inevitable. At least the end should be quick. "We're locked in, then?" Pizer leaned back in his chair. Holland nodded agreement. "Navigation is sealed, probably in case the pilot is incapacitated, to hold the ship on course. Reinhardt was determined to make his journey, even if unconscious." "So we're going into the black hole after all, in spite of everything." Holland glanced over at his first officer, his friend. "Check." Now that their destination was unavoidable, McCrae found herself speaking quite calmly. "Let's pray that he was the prophet he claimed to be." Holland looked at her, his expression conveying a multitude of emotions. It was too late to put into words. At that point, words would have been inadequate anyway. "He who hesitates gathers no moss, and a rolling stone is lost." Vincent had moved to the back of the cockpit. The thought of being abruptly reduced to the size of a subatomic particle was one he could comprehend better than any of them. It frightened him. Pizer patted his side comfortingly. Holland watched the instruments. There were many he recognized and a fair number he did not. Several were evidently designed to monitor events beyond mere human perception. The probe continued to accelerate. Ahead of them, a blackness was eating the sky. Vincent extended his arms, braced himself against the sides of the cockpit. Holland continued to gaze at McCrae, and she gazed back, both sorrowing for what might have been. Pizer watched them both as the ship began to rotate, ignoring the advice of her outraged stabilizing systems. Something was squeezing Holland's guts, pressing down on his head and up at his feet. A readout on the console was marked in increments of several thousands. It had by now crawled patiently halfway up its length. Abruptly, simultaneous with the fading of light inside the probe, it flicked upward and vanished. Much else disappeared with it. Light, time, a sense of being alive, the efficacy of existence. A thought tickled Holland's brain. and 1,000 years passed on Earth. He was dimly aware that they must have crossed the event horizon, the line where things vanished forever, time and space together. He considered the rhyme, then he considered something else. He should not have been able to consider his considering. Something else impossible was happening. Light. Light should not happen within the confines of a collapsar. Matter should not happen either. Perhaps he was no longer matter. Was pure thought affected by gravity? Did he still possess a body? He thought he was looking down at himself, but there no longer seemed to be anything there. Only darkness and quiet and peace. He was alone, adrift in an irrational dimension. Then he imagined there were other thoughts curling and entwining among his own, though he could not immediately identify them. Kate? Charlie? Vincent? They remained infinitely distant, tantalizingly near. Only the light ahead grew clearer. He imagined it had to be ahead. His speculations turned to the possible existence of white holes, knife wounds into other universes. He wondered if Reinhardt could sense them. Then there was something familiar again, recognizable, warm. "Come to me," it was saying. "Come to me, Dan. It's the only way." Kate. And she responded, "You must join with me, Dan. And you, Charlie. And Vincent. If you can, Vincent. Only thoughts have a chance inside here. Physical materialities will be crushed down to nothing, but thought, the essences of ourselves, I think we have a chance that way." Holland could feel something warm and all-encompassing reaching out to envelop him. The fragmentation of himself that had begun halted. He remained he. "It's working," came the powerful thought. "It's the S-plane, my thought projection ability. It will keep us together if we fight for it." They blended, flowed together. Thought itself strained beyond its normal borders under the unimaginable force of the collapsar. Then they were through, and amazingly still whole. Kate was Kate, Charlie Charlie, and Dan Holland still Dan Holland. Even Vincent was there. They were themselves, and yet something strange and new. A galactic sea change that produced all of the above, and a new unified mind thing. That was Kate, Charlie, Dan, Vincent also. Dimly, it, perceived the final annihilation of a minuscule agglutination of refined masses. The Palomino. It was gone, lost in an infinite brightness. It remained, content and infinite now, as the white hole itself. They had been compressed, compacted, but had passed beyond and through, with their selves still intact. With the passage came peace, and time to contemplate. On a beach was a grain of sand. The sand was part of a continent. The continent a component of a world. The world a speck of substance in the sea of infinity. They were part of that world, part of every world, for in passing out the white hole their substance had become dispersed. An atom of Charlie to a 9-world system, a molecule of Kate to a local cluster of stars. A tiny diffuse section of Holland spread thin over a dozen galaxies. Yet they could still think. For thought does not respect the trifling limitations of time and space. They were still them, and this new thing they had become. Their thoughts spanned infinity, as did their finely spread substance, and they now had an eternity in which to contemplate the universe they had become.